Hello, I'm Charles Osgood of CBS News. 50 years ago, back in 1947, a 24-seat propeller-driven airplane, a DC-4, rumbled down the runway in Minneapolis and took off on an ocean-crossing maiden voyage that harkened back to that of Charles Lindbergh 2 decades earlier. That inaugural flight took the passengers, the crew, the airline, and the many nations involved on an historic journey, one that brought together widely varying cultures, helped develop international trade to unforeseen heights, and ultimately made the world a much smaller place. The airline, of course, was Northwest, and the flight was number 801. It lifted off on July 15th, 1947, taking the Great Circle route up over Alaska, out across the Aleutian Islands, and on to Tokyo, Shanghai, and Manila. Even though the flight took more than 33 hours, the new route instantly became the fastest way to get to Asia. Croyle Hunter, president of Northwest at the time, has justifiably been called a visionary. He and the other Northwest leaders foresaw, when others did not, the unprecedented economic potential of the Pacific Rim. More than just a route to Japan, they envisioned an entire Asian route structure that could service all the great cities of the Pacific. The men and women of Northwest Airlines have stayed the course and have remained committed to serving the world.
We were the pioneers of going in there and shortening that route to be able to get there because you know how long it takes for a boat to get from Frisco to Japan.
I thought at the time that there must be people at the top really using their head to, think this up.
With Northwest coming, it was brought a lot of hope to a lot of people.
Northwest had ambitions to go to the Orient long before they actually did, and they were afraid that they were not going to get anywhere without some proof.
In the early days, when Northwest came onto the route in 1947, we have to remember that all route authority was very strictly controlled from the Civil Aeronautics Board in Washington.
To create an airline all the way from the Twin Cities to Alaska by way of the trackless wastes of northwestern Canada. There were no radio facilities, there were no stops to pick up fuel. They went to work and built all those facilities and took off for Alaska and proved that it could be done.
With this experience in hand, Northwest received permission to complete the Great Circle route to Japan and beyond. This was at a time when no other airline would touch the route, skeptical as they were that the unpredictable weather of Alaska and the North Pacific would make it too difficult to maintain a schedule. But with their years of cold weather experience, the people of Northwest saw it differently. Seeing the possibility of shaving significant time and mileage versus the Southern Pacific route, a 3-day-a-week schedule was carefully plotted and planned. And then came the day, July 15th, 1947.
We left here, I think, around 3 or 3:30 in the morning. I can't remember that far back for sure. But we went to Edmonton, and it took us 5.5 hours. The flight from Edmonton to Anchorage was 7 hours and 15 minutes. So the overall must have been, I figured, 12 hours and 45 minutes.
From there on, they really were on their own because they were headed by way of the little one-horse island called Shemya, which was nothing but a big rock in the Pacific Ocean, was just long enough for a good airstrip and a little bit more, and that's about all.
The problem with Shemya was they had these severe crosswinds when it could be fogged in almost down to 0, and the wind can still be blowing at a high rate, which is unbelievable. Most of the time in fog conditions, there's no wind.
We had to rely on celestial navigation, dead reckoning, meaning you just plan your flight and based on your knowledge of the winds, however good it was or bad.
And so they made the refueling stop at Shemya and took off again for Japan, and they arrived in Tokyo to a tremendous celebration. The Japanese were delighted, everybody was delighted that they had proved that it could be done.
Eagerly waiting that night was the crew that would soon take Flight 801 on its next leg from Tokyo. including Warren Avenson.
I was the co-pilot. The captain was Bob Sparkman, and we had a flight radio operator and navigator required in those days. Don't need either of them now. And we, based in Tokyo, picked it up at Tokyo, flew at Tokyo, Shanghai, Manila. There was only one passenger, and that passenger was a woman, American woman, whose hobby was riding first flights, new flights. When an airline inaugurated new service, she'd buy a ticket, keep her ticket, have it stamped, have it autographed, and that was her hobby.
Initially, there were only maybe 2 or 3 passengers, but I remember after 3 years, we were going out with full loads, 73,000 pounds, 24 seats, all filled.
This was about the time that Northwest started calling itself Northwest Orient Airlines, and this terminology became widely used both all over the United States and all over Japan and all over the world.
Now, flying in the 1940s was very different from what we experience today. The unpressurized cabin of the DC-4 meant thin air at higher altitudes and wide variations in temperatures. Northwest's initial flights to Asia were long. Minneapolis-Tokyo was scheduled in 33 and a half hours. But all 24 seats on board were first class.
Well, the reason for the 24, I suppose, it's for the comfort of the passenger, because you could almost stretch horizontal, with the footrest and whatnot.
It was very boring for the passengers. There was nothing to do in those days. They didn't have any tape in there to watch, no movies.
I noticed that for government people who were in a hurry to get to Washington or get to the States, they would always take Northwest. You'd see repeat passengers board,
These passengers, they came at least twice a month from the States. We remember the drinks. He drinks martini, he drinks scotch, he drinks bourbon. So we would prepare all that. Of course, the passenger is not aware of that. And the minute he comes in, before he can even fasten his seatbelt, the drink is with him.
When they see us coming across the tarmac, they would stand there with a gin and tonic ready. As we stepped on board, we had a drink in our hand.
I can remember when that first flight of the Stratocruiser came in, I couldn't believe how many people were out there just to see the airplane.
To go downstairs and have a drink with your friends was a great thing. And every passenger who remembers those days will always remember the Stratocruiser's downstairs lounge.
The Stratocruiser gave the airline class. It's the first time that Northwest had anything that they could brag about that nobody else had, because Northwest was the only airline that flew the Stratocruiser both domestically and across the seas.
In the early 1950s, Northwest helped to establish Japan Airlines by providing technical expertise, training, financial support, and even airplanes.
Northwest brought in 3 Martin 202s, those twin-engine airplanes, which they purchased before JAL and got JAL going.
I was sent over to Japan to teach the supervisory personnel that were going to be the initial supervisors for Japanese Airlines when they organized.
Well, I had a fellow that worked for me in the stockroom that applied to work for me in a way, and he went over there and to JL, and I met him recently, and he retired as a DC-10 captain.
Northwest Airlines played a very big part. And I think when we look at Japanese airlines today, when you can say that we were the fledgling part of it, that it was Northwest Airlines that started this, to me, this is great. This is I just feel real good about it.
The decade of the 1950s was where Northwest consolidated its position. It did this by improving its flights everywhere, and particularly in a fairly ambitious program of acquiring new airplanes.
When I joined Northwest, Northwest was operating a DC-4. And then introduced a DC-6. There was the Super Constellation, then a DC-7.
We saw how the ages of these aircraft going from one to another, the improvement to become modern, from propeller to jet prop to pure jet.
Northwest set itself apart from its competitors in the 60s in several different ways, one of which was that it became the first all-jet fleet to the Orient. Northwest added service to Osaka and, of course, to Hong Kong. It not only helped Northwest, but it helped the economy in all of these Orient stations.
I was sent to Hong Kong to establish the Hong Kong station. First flight of Northwest Air, so I have to open up the Hong Kong station, train them the right procedure, and also the weight and balance of the aircraft.
Yeah, 69 and 70 were exciting years, more so than many, because that was the first time that Northwest was able to arrange routes which included Hawaii and Japan and the west coast of the United States. And of course, that meant great things for tourism, both from and to Japan. Once again, Northwest took the lead by being the first airline to offer 747 service, and this gave them a leg up on their competition, of course. And from that time forward, the 747 was at the heart of all of Northwest services to the Orient.
I can remember once when I was on a layover at Seattle, when I heard the public address system announce the next flight, and it happened to be a Northwest Orient Airlines flight. And I can still hear the pride in the voice of the announcer with which he announced that this flight to Tokyo was non-stop.
Northwest was the first airline to offer 747-400 service, using that as their number one aircraft, especially to the Orient. It was just plain today's airplane, and everything else was yesterday's airplane. And as a result, the business then continued to improve to a point where several other city pairs were added. The new service included Los Angeles to Seoul and vice versa, and Detroit, Osaka, vice versa. In 1996, the Detroit-Beijing flights marked the first time ever that anyone had flown nonstop to China. The most recent addition to the Orient routes has been the Minneapolis-St. Paul-Osaka service in both directions. This service began in 1997, and this again was Northwest taking advantage of the fact that here was another opportunity to help in the growth of the Orient as well as in the growth of U.S. business.
To Northwest and to the world, it was history, a new route, a route that had not been flown commercially ever by anybody.
It certainly was much more valuable to us than we dreamed of then. It certainly helped us out a great deal today, too.
When we started to mingle with the other countries in close proximity, and they were coming back with us, we began to know the people, and I think it was big for the airline in that context, and also big for the country.
I think I was very fortunate, and now I'm very proud. And I wish I could give something back to Northwest where they gave to me.
It brought us together, in touch.
The world is a smaller place now than it was in 1947. The many peoples of Asia seem much closer. The Pacific Rim is an industrial giant. The challenges were enormous. The conditions often difficult, sometimes harsh. But with a 50-year legacy of pioneering air service to Asia, Northwest has earned its place in history.